Thank you, Stuart. I'd like to start by paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we are lucky to be able to meet on today, and to pay respect to their elders past and present. So today I'm going to talk about why boycott, divestment, sanctions, and why free speech about boycott, divestment and sanctions may well be the best hope for both peace and human rights in Israel and Palestine. New media presents the opportunity to challenge the artificial dichotomy by the Israeli government and its supporters, and often accepted, as we've discussed this morning, unquestionably by the conventional media, that the promotion of basic human rights for Palestinians is somehow a barrier for peace. That somehow the promotion of basic human rights for Palestinians is separate from and contradictory to the promotion of peace in Israel and Palestine. This could not be further from the truth. Violent conflict drives human rights abuses, and human rights abuses and reactions to human rights abuses drive conflict and further violence. I'm going to talk about how boycott, divestment, sanctions is a responsible, evidence-based approach, which is particularly important given the abysmal and continual failure of so-called official peace initiatives, and how the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign acknowledges that addressing human rights can be a powerful driver for peace and enables peoples globally, both elites and non-elites, to positively contribute to these peace efforts. So Stuart, as Stuart mentioned, my name is Paul Duffill. I'm a visiting scholar at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. I also work as a trainer in dialogue and conflict resolution for the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies as well. And my background in peace and conflict studies is really why I came to see why boycott, divestment, sanctions is so important, and I think so interesting. And particularly my work is working as a trainer for dialogue and conflict resolution. So I started my interest in training in peace and conflict studies about 20 years ago in the non-violent martial art of Aikido. I wonder if there's anyone here who's dabbled in a bit of Aikido here and there. There we go, right. And that really got me sort of interested in the connections really between human rights and peace, and the idea that we can promote the rights and human rights of the victim while still being concerned about and still having compassion for what might be termed as the oppressor. And as Randa was mentioning this morning, I think that how Randa was talking about dealing with the narrative of the victim in Western society, where there's a dominant narrative where the victim should be docile, impassive, silent, and, as I used to refer to in my very private school in New Zealand, turn the other cheek. Aikido really introduced me to the idea that that we can respond in a practical, non-violent, safe way, an effective way, but not by turning the other cheek, by being actively resistant, but also being compassionate to what might be termed as the other. The approach of one of the founders of peace and conflict studies has been really influential with me. He's a Norwegian academic, Johan Galtung, and I think he provides a very helpful way of explaining what's happening in Israel-Palestine, and a not just helpful, but a very practical way of looking at this. I mean, for me, working in peace and conflict studies is both optimistic and pragmatic. If I was interested in theory and problems, I'd probably be studying something like the philosophy of philosophy. But, and so I'm very wary as well that often academics, for a range of reasons, will be sort of bitten by the bug that we might refer to as paralysis by analysis, and be very hesitant. Academics and other talking heads might be very hesitant about putting forward an idea that might actually work, that might actually change things. So Johan Galtung, one of the founding fathers of peace and conflict studies, he talks about one of the hallmarks of his approach is honing in on the unarticulated assumptions and contradictions that drive a conflict. I think when we're talking about Israel-Palestine, one of those key assumptions that is no doubt driving the conflict and the violence is the all too common assumption that Jewish people will only be safe if they live in a country where Jews dominate over non-Jews. This is the concrete reality that sort of hides behind that very euphemistic term, a Jewish state. that many supporters of Israel and the Israeli government just sort of casually drop into conversation as though it's sort of common sense. But of course, the idea that one ethno-religious group would dominate over all other ethno-religious groups is fundamentally undemocratic. So of course, in addition to the illegal occupation of Palestinian land within Israel itself, within internationally recognized Israel, I should say, there are of course over 50 laws that Israeli NGO Adala has documented, which discriminate against people based on the fact that they're not Jewish. Only the most well-known examples of this is of course a law of return, where if a Jewish person can, or I should say a person can convince Israeli state bureaucrats they are sufficiently Jewish, whatever that means, they automatically qualify for citizenship. Suffice to say that this right does not extend to Palestinians whose families have lived on the land for centuries. So the idea that Jewish people will only be safe if they live in a country where Jews dominate over non-Jews, that's something we refer to in negotiation practice as being stuck on a position. Being stuck on a position. In this sense, a position is a potential solution that we have, which can only be satisfied in one way. In this example, having a country that is where there is a lack of basic equality before the law, where there is entrenched domination of Jews over non-Jews. So often what we find in very complex, difficult negotiation is the basic legitimate needs that people have. For instance, Palestinians and Israelis' legitimate need for safety and security, those basic needs become enmeshed and people stop being able to see the light between those basic needs of safety and security and the position that is being touted by the dominant narratives, in this case, a Jewish state. And you've noticed that often when this is mentioned in interviews with the media and that sort of thing, that this term is hardly ever interrogated or questioned or sort of any sort of criticism of it. There was an interview with Peter Slezak, and then there was a member of the Israel lobby, I think it was Nick Duffill, I think last year. And Nick Duffill, mentioned how he supported a Jewish state, and the journalist just completely bypassed it, didn't even batter an eyelid, and just went on to, criticizing why BDS is a terrible idea. So there is, of course, positions, unhelpful positions on groups that are critical of Israel or that promote violence against Israelis. Yeah, for example, some Palestinian groups or other groups that might argue that the only way that Palestinians would be safe and secure would be if Jews were eliminated from the land of Israel or historical Palestine. So there are problematic positions, right? I'm not saying that the assumption that the only way that Jews will be safe is if Jews dominate over non-Jews. I'm not saying that's the only problematic assumption, problematic position, but the key issue for us in Australia is that the Australian government provides massive support and funding to organisations that are actively involved in promoting that problematic Israeli government position. For instance, over the last 10 years, if you've paid taxes, everyone who's paid taxes here, congratulations. Your tax money have been used to fund over $1.5 billion in contracts to Israeli arms companies. $1.5 billion, that's billion with a B. $1.5 billion over 10 years. Can we imagine that any of that sort of money would go towards Palestinian arms companies? It's unimaginable, isn't it? Added to that is, of course, the many public statements by Julie Bishop and George Brandis saying that either Palestine isn't occupied or that the occupation is somehow not illegal under international law. And there's a wonderful article written by a colleague of ours, Professor Ben Saul, a wonderful Jewish Australian jurist at the University of Sydney, professor of international law, he should know, answering Julie Bishop's claim. Show me the law that shows that the occupation and the settlements are illegal. And Professor Ben Saul says, okay, Julie, here you go, I will. And he proceeds to list them. And he ends his article by expressing his being exacerbated by how embarrassed he is. He says, every other country seems to know the international law. Why doesn't our own foreign minister? So that's really one of the issues here, is that we have this deep double standard here. Even though, of course, there is violence on a number of sides. I don't say both sides, because there's not just two sides, right? But the fact is the activities of the Australian government and the Australian taxpayer, without our choice, is being put behind the violence of one particular party, and that's the Israeli government and its supporters. Of course, the Australian government provides a wide range of sanctions against countries in Israel's neighbourhood who have terrible human rights records. We're talking about countries having sanctions against countries and groups in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, and of course a range of Palestinian groups. Although, of course, one country in the region with a highly problematic human rights record stands out as being conspicuously immune to Australian sanctions. That one country is Israel. Instead of sanctions, of course, we have massive funding of what I mentioned, that $1.5 billion over 10 years. We have massive funding of Israel's arms companies. That principal arms company that the Australian government, the Australian taxpayer funds, is called Albert Systems. Albert Systems provides spying equipment for the illegal wall that's built throughout the West Bank. So the connections there and the double standard there is very real and I think very important. So for us in Australia and other countries that actively support Israeli violence, this is where I think the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign comes in. You've got to remember that the essence of any boycott, whether you agree with it or not, is about one thing. It's about withdrawing support. Withdrawing support. That's why the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign is so relevant for Australia, because we're already supporting them. And I think this is something that's very difficult for the sort of talking heads in the Western media and academia and policy government and stuff, is that there's that sort of that white savior complex, you know, that has been alluded to this morning, you know, and it's so deeply embedded in Western culture that we even see it on shows like Game of Thrones, you know, where and the idea that we somehow have to jump in and save these poor local native people from the problems they're having, and we've got the solution, we know what it is, let's jump in there and save them. Boycott, divestment, sanctions doesn't buy into this narrative, and I think that's why there's a lot of criticism from international governments, is it says, and this is something that I guess is very difficult for a lot of politicians to accept and a lot of government to accept, before we go ahead and tell other people what to do, let's be pragmatic, realistic and ethical. Let's first take a look at our own behaviour. What behaviour are we doing, are we already doing, which is making the situation worse? That's why boycotts, divestment, sanctions are so important, because it starts with our own behaviour. Without telling people, Israelis and Palestinians and other people in the region, how they can fix their problems, let's first get our own house in order. And unfortunately, a lot of politicians are less interested in that than pointing the finger. So part of my research is looking at what are the common conditions for effective dialogue and negotiation? How do we know when dialogue and negotiation is likely to work? Yeah, and what I would sort of define as a sort of a Stevie Wonderian approach. I think that the Australian government and its allies have that Stevie Wonderian approach to peace and dialogue and negotiation in Israel-Palestine. You know, that old sort of thing. And like, I'm really glad that Michael decided not to sing this morning, because that sort of put me off the hook. Thank you. You know, but Stevie Wonder's wonderful line, when you believe in things you don't understand, you will suffer very superstitious. So unfortunately, the Australian government and its allies have adopted a very superstitious approach to dialogue, negotiation. They think it's wonderful, they think it's amazing, but they're not really willing to talk about how it can actually happen. They're hoping that just this time, you know, for the 99 times or 999 times when they've had dialogue partners together and it hasn't worked, maybe on the 1000th time, by magic from the heavens, suddenly perhaps the dialogue and negotiation will be effective. But of course, when we look at the research from what we know about effective dialogue and negotiation, there are clearly set out conditions from a whole range of disciplines. Yeah, we're talking sociology, political science, peace building, conflict resolution, international relations, on what actually works. What are the conditions where dialogue and negotiation work? One of those first conditions is that the parties need to find themselves in a stalemate. There needs to be relatively equal power where the parties are in a stalemate. Now that sounds like common sense, right? Apparently, unless you're the Australian government and its allies. That's one of the very well established conditions. The second condition is that the parties need to sense a way out. A way out. So if you like, the stalemate is the push and the way out is the pull. Okay, the way out where they can meet their basic needs and human rights in a way that will be safe and secure for them. Clearly, under the present circumstances, neither of those conditions of a stalemate or a way out are present for the Palestinians or for for that matter, for Israelis. Of course, the Israeli government's tactics on using dialogue to actually stifle dialogue, sort of a perverse, sort of reverse Zen sort of approach to it, if you like, was outlined by outgoing Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir in 1992. And he candidly remarked in the New York Times that if he had remained in office, he would have dragged out peace negotiations in order to buy time to dramatically increase Jewish settlements in the Palestinian territories. He actually said this on record. Since then, of course, we've seen his plan and this prognosis play out. Since 1992, the settlement population in the occupied territories has more than doubled during the so-called peace process. And of course, last year, Israel's then housing minister, Uri Ariel, predicted that the number of settlements would increase by 40% by 2019. So we've got this surreal situation where we've got peace talks and negotiations happening while the Israeli government and its allies are actively undermining the conditions for successful peace talks. And where the language of peace is actually being used to block peace. Yeah, so during this Oslo peace process, we have the dramatic increase in settlements. And of course, when you have an illegal occupation of a foreign people's land, of another land, and you have a dramatic increase of settlements, that represents a dramatic breaking of equal power. Yeah, the power becomes even more imbalanced, even less of a stalemate, and peace becomes even further away, and Palestinians are presented with even less of a way out. Now, of course, I'm not talking in the way that Palestinians are somehow passive victims here, and that the Western countries need to fly in and save the situation. I think what we need to do, in the term what we might loosely call Western countries, is first take a look at our own behaviour and acknowledge that actually our own behaviour, for example, the Australian government's $1.5 billion over 10 years, I hope I've repeated that enough, is actually pushing the parties away from peace, away from peace. Even if you don't want to talk about human rights, right? Even if people are terrified of the idea of Palestinians having basic human rights, if you want to talk about peace, well, often those people who are the progressive accept Palestine that we've talked about there, even if you're interested and fixated on this idea of dialogue, conflict resolution, and peace, then the settlements don't make sense, and BDS does. As Israeli historian Avi Shleim colorfully put it, Israel actually has no incentive to conclude an agreement with the Palestinians. Rather, it sees it in its interests, in Israel's interests, to draw out negotiations, like a man who pretends to negotiate over the division of a pizza while he keeps eating it. If the current situation presents no adverse stalemate for Israeli military and government, it likewise presents no way out for Palestinians. This, of course, was dramatically demonstrated in the publication of the Palestine Papers back in 2011, where we saw that the Palestine Papers showed the dramatic concessions that Palestinian negotiators felt like they were forced to give, to offer their Israeli negotiating counterparts, right? When those dramatic concessions were actually made public to the Palestinian public, they were widely rejected by the Palestinian negotiators' own Palestinian constituents. Of course, much has been made of Benjamin Netanyahu's pledge during the last Israeli election campaign that there will be no Palestinian state. This has, of course, been established in the Likud Charter since 1977, and it hasn't been revised either. Of course, the Likud Charter sets out clearly the Jordan River will be the permanent eastern border of the state of Israel. That's the Jordan River, which is the border with the country of Jordan, not the border with the West Bank. And the Likud Charter also sets out the government of Israel flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. So we need to ask ourselves, why is our taxpayers' money being used to support these sort of policies? And why are statements being made that are coming from our politicians who, of course, are paid by us? Even people who aren't passionate about human rights for Palestinians, there's something of a financial cost for Australia here too. Of course, the financial cost isn't the most important or the only most important thing, but I think we need to think about how we can relate the value of what's happening to people who are not already inside the tent, already not converted, if you like. Of course, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign works to bring about this equalised power and this stalemate and a way out. These conditions which are absolutely critical for effective dialogue and negotiation. Of course, the three aims of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement are ending the occupation and colonisation of all Arab lands occupied in June 1967 and dismantling the wall, recognising the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. Yeah, this is of course really critical. We talked about the 50 laws in Israel that discriminate against people. This is Israel proper, not just in the West Bank, that discriminate against people on the fact that they just happen not to be Jewish. And the third goal of the Boycott, Divestment, Change campaign, respecting, promoting and protecting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their home and properties they fled or expelled from, as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So these three goals are obviously very important for peace in terms of Israel and Palestine, but it's also critical for regional security and regional peace as well. So there's an initiative that was put forward by the Arab League and the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation called the Arab Peace Initiative, launched in 2002. Have many people heard of that, the Arab Peace Initiative? Okay, groovy, a bit of a sprinkling there. The interesting thing is that the conditions, the aims of BDS very closely map onto those conditions for peace laid out in the Arab Peace Initiative, including an end to the occupation and a just resolution for Palestinian refugees. So this is really why, for me, as a peace academic, I came across and I came over to boycott, divestment, sanctions, because I saw that contrary to what for me as a specialist in the area is ridiculous and irresponsible dominant narrative that human rights, active advocacy is somehow contradictory to peace, boycott, divestment, sanctions provides a practical way for us to move forward and to promote peace in ways that we're not just dependent on the actions of government and the whims of government, but something that we can actively take part in ourselves. And we've seen it with the wonderful successes against businesses which have been abusing Palestinian human rights, like we're talking about Veolia, we're talking about Ahava, we're talking about G4S. And those companies are not small, right? Like I was reading in one of these lovely puff pieces that the UK security company G4S had commissioned in a sort of a man's sort of muscle magazine, you know. Not that I only read those magazines for research purposes. I was just browsing at the supermarket, I promise. And G4S was proudly touting the fact that, and get this, it's the third largest employer in the world. Third largest employer in the world. This is big bickies, yeah? The fact that the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign has encouraged this massive multinational security company, who, it's probably not surprising, doesn't have a wonderful respect for human rights in other parts of the world either, including, you've got to remember, G4S was actually, and this is sort of blow you away, G4S was disallowed by the coalition government in Australia for running the detention camps because its human rights abuses were too bad. All right, this is the sort of company who has been encouraged to behave in an ethical way, yeah, by the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign, you know, who the third largest employer in the world. So I'll just close. I'm probably running out of time. So I'll just close with, I think, some, what I came back to, I think, so that we're not getting stuck on this paralysis by analysis. And sort of, you know, as Stuart says, making sure we're not, you know, criticising the ship's navigation as the ship is going down. I think there are some wonderful signs for opportunities and progress in the Australian mediascape and the public opinion. Now, of course, all of these opportunities come with qualifications, and people will probably want to shoot their hands up with qualifications the moment that I mention them. But I think it's important to think about, obviously the problems and the issues are important, but where are the levers available that we can maybe pull to help get some change? It's obviously very important to understand the issues and the problems and that sort of thing, and of course us academics love to do that. It's a lot easier than us academics putting our head in the chopping block and actually coming up with a positive proposal, which is perhaps why the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign comes from civil society. So some of these important signs of progress, I think, is the fact that settlements are being increasingly criticised by international governments, and we're talking Israel's allies, the US, Canada, New Zealand, for this, and the settlements are being criticised for actually inhibiting the peace process. And if you look at the statements, even by that wonderful expresser of truth and everything that is true, the White House press secretary, he seems to be becoming visibly, increasingly pissed off by having to completely restate this position. And every time he's restated it, even during, you know, January when Israel was announcing a lot of expansions of settlements, he kept on saying, the White House press secretary, the US's long-held position is that the settlements are negative to peace, do not help the peace process. And then now the US official line has started to become, the settlements have been designed to kneecap the peace process, to inhibit the peace process. And we've seen similar comments by Canada, by New Zealand, which you'll probably recognise particularly resonates with me if I haven't done a very good job in, concealing my New Zealand accent to avoid the playful prejudice on that from Australians. But yeah, so I think that's one important thing, and I think that it's something that we really need to try and push and hit when we're writing about this. By the way, Australia's allies agree that the settlements do not help the peace process, and this is something that I'm trying to sort of massage into my opinion pieces that I put to habitually cautious and fairly terrified opinion editors of left-wing newspapers in Australia. Another wonderful, I think, opportunity. Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Another wonderful opportunity is the fact that Netanyahu and his cabinet have actually come out and publicly rejected the peace process. So I think the fact that that's a lot less ambiguous now and a lot more clear is something that we can build on, and to show that even the Israeli government is not working super strongly towards peace and is actually working to undermine it. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Cool, thank you.